Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is Technique Tuesday. Today, I will demonstrate 3 or 4, depending on how you count them, methods for making sure that you have enough yarn tail when you cast on for the long tail cast on. Each method has advantages and disadvantages depending on the particular project. For each method, I'll explain the process and demonstrate it to see how it works in a given scenario, and then talk about those advantages and disadvantages and what situations that method might be more useful or less useful. So let's get started. This first method is a way to estimate the amount of yarn that you will want to use. So it really works best for small and medium circumference or width items. So for a small circumference item, width item, something that's 8 to maybe 12 inches wide, you will need about a yard for your yarn tail. And the way to quickly estimate 1 yard is to hold the end of the yarn, pinch it with your fingers, stretch your arm out as far as you can, and that is about a yard for most average size adult people. You still need to add 4 to 6 inches extra for the yarn tail that you will thread with a yarn needle and weave in at the end of your project. But that's how you get your 1 yard. And that will work for small circumference or small width items, scarves, mittens, gloves, socks, things like that. If you have something that's medium in circumference or medium in width, those kinds of things would be like a hat, the circumference of an infant sweater if you were casting on in the round, or if you were knitting an adult sweater but you were knitting it flat, you could cast on like the back of a sweater up to 24 inches in width by measuring off approximately 2 yards. So 1, 2, and then once again, add some yarn tail. So those are really good for items that are going to be knit in stockinette or garter stitch in that full circumference. Not a good solution for something that's going to be heavily cabled, because you would need a lot more stitches with the same yarn and needles that you would use for stockinette, and that is, going based on the circumference. When it's heavily cabled, that is not going to be able to estimate accurately like it will for garter stitch or stockinette. Okay, so let's test this out. I will measure off 2 yards for this and cast on for a hat. I've measured off my 2 yards. I'm going to add a little bit extra for that yarn tail. So this will be my starting point for casting on. For a hat with this yarn weight, that's going to be about 19 to 20 inches in circumference, I will want to cast on 96 stitches. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll show you how much yarn tail I have left over. All right, so I've cast on 96 stitches. This is what I would need for a 19-inch hat. And this is how much yarn tail I would have left over. If I wanted something that was 20 inches or 22 inches in circumference, I would still have quite a bit of yarn left. If I wanted something 24 inches in circumference, that might be, pushing it close. So if you need the maximum amount, you might just want to add a little bit when we're talking about the range of sizes. It's the way that I use when I am casting on for really common accessories like hats, mittens, scarves, things like that, either the 1 yard or the 2 yard. So I wouldn't use the estimation approach if I needed to cast on hundreds and hundreds of stitches. Or if I had a really precious yarn, either because it was very expensive or because I just really needed to be careful about how much I used so that I didn't waste any, because I'm not sure if it's going to last, I would not use this method. As a side note, this method is based on needing 3 times as much yarn for a row of knitting as the knitting is wide. The quick nose to fingers estimate to measure off a yard is enough yarn for something 12 inches wide and more than enough for something narrower than that. But given how small the item is, the excess tail isn't going to be too outrageously long. Again, This method is only an estimate, and it works well for most yarn weights. It doesn't work as well for super bulky yarns where you are more likely to need around 4 times as much yarn as the item is wide. This second method isn't an estimation, it's an actual measurement for the amount of yarn that you are going to need. What you're going to do is you're going to take that very tip of the tail and you are going to wrap the yarn around for as many stitches as you need. So if you needed 25, you would wrap it around 25 times. Okay, so I've done 25 times. This is the amount I need to in order to cast on for the edge, but I still need to add my 4 to 6 inches, which is 10 to 15 centimeters of yarn tail that is going to hang at the end. So I'm going to start my cast on right here, and I will cast on 25 stitches. Okay, here's my 25th stitch, and you can see why you need some tail, because you need to be able to still hang on to something at the end. You can see I have that amount of tail left. So that was a really good way of measuring the amount of yarn I would need for 25 stitches. Now, if you needed a lot more than that, then you could do something like, let's say I needed 100 stitches. I could wrap this around 10 times or 20 times or 25 times, however many times I wanted to, and then I could use that amount. So right here I've got 20 stitches. So if I wanted to do 40 stitches, I could just fold that in half and I could say, okay, that's 40. I could fold it again. That's 60. That's 80, etc. I could just keep using that initial measurement in order to figure out the additional increments I needed. And then again, always add that extra 4 to 6 inches. I think 6 inches is better, just so you have enough to hang on to at the end. And then you would start your cast on. So the advantage of this method is it gives you more precision. So you're not going to potentially waste a yarn by having too long of a tail, and you probably aren't going to end up too short either. It's going to be pretty exact. It works for any number of stitches. The downside is that it takes a while to do that. So you can't just immediately start casting on within a second or two. It's going to take a little prep time before you're ready to cast on. But it is pretty accurate, and you don't run into the issue with, well, what if I'm casting on something that's got cables, whatever. You're really focusing on the number of stitches you need and the amount of yarn that's needed for each one of those stitches. This last method requires no measuring and no estimating. You're going to get exactly the amount of yarn that you need for your cast on. So there's 2 ways that you can do this. This method that I'm going to show first will work for any yarn, whether it's animal fiber, plant fiber, synthetic, whatever. It's going to work. You're going to start with either both ends of the same ball of yarn. So I have the end from the outside of the ball as well as the one that's coming from the inside. So I've got both of those tails, or you could use 2 separate balls. Either way is going to work. So you're going to measure off a certain amount right here where you're going to start, and you're just going to hold those yarns, put some tension on them, holding them in your right hand. And then you can just set yourself up with the slingshot that you need for your cast on, and you can start casting on. If you don't like this idea, if that feels insecure to you, you can start with a slip knot using both yarns and put that on the needle. That does not count as a stitch. That's just another way of anchoring that yarn. And then you can cast on. So you can cast on as many stitches as you need. This is a really good method to use when you have to cast on something that's very large in circumference, like maybe the entire circumference of an adult sweater that you're knitting seamlessly from the bottom up. It's really good for things like blankets that are really wide, either one of those things. So this takes absolutely no prep time. As soon as you've got both of those yarn tails, you can start casting on. As soon as you have finished casting on as many stitches as you need, you're going to take the thumb yarn, so the yarn that had been around your thumb that was being used to create the edge, not the index finger. If you pull on this yarn, it's pulling on the stitch on the needle. So you don't want to cut this one. You want to cut this one. And you want to cut it so that you have a long enough tail to thread into a yarn needle so that you can weave in later. So you're going to cut your tail, but you can cut it to being exactly what you want. So if you are joining this in the round, then where the beginning of the round meets the end of the round, you're going to have all 3 yarn tails in the same place that you will need to weave in. This is a yarn that is wool. It's 100% wool, and it is not superwash, so that it can be felted. You can join the 2 ends of the ball together using a felted join or a spit felt, or if you know other ways of joining 2 yarn tails together, like the braided join or the Russian join, you could use those. I'm not very good at either one of those, so that isn't a choice I would make. So I typically either use this with a superwash wool on a blanket so that the 2 tails are at one end and 1 tail is at the other. Or if I am knitting something large in circumference, I'm typically using a feltable wool like this one is. So I've separated the plies at the end so they're a little bit less bulky. And then I'm going to moisten this. If you don't like the idea of putting these tails in your mouth, get a spray bottle or dunk them in some water or something, but I just put them in my mouth. And once they're wet, I cross them over, and then I turn those tails back so that you've got those, you're creating a hook, and you've got the thinner tails are overlapping with the main yarn. And then you're going to apply friction. That's what causes things to felt: moisture, friction, and temperature change. So I'm not just mildly rubbing, I'm rubbing my hands together. My hands are getting hot, and that is causing them to felt. So this part still is not quite felted together. I'm going to lick my palm and felt it some more. So that's a felted join. Again, if you know the Russian join or a braided join, you can use that. Once you've joined these 2 yarn tails together, then you can do your cast on. And I'm not going to put this as my starting point. I'm putting it a little bit further away. This is a yarn that's going to be over my index finger. I'm going to start right here. It's just a little easier and less bulky to start. And then I can just cast on, again, as many stitches as I need for this particular project. And then when I'm done casting on, again, I take that thumb yarn and then I cut it. And then I can just continue on. And this is really great if you're working in the round, because you'll just have the 1 yarn tail. When you join the beginning of the round to the end of the round, you won't have 3 yarn tails. Any of these methods could be used for any project. I tend to pick and choose which method I'm going to use depending on the project. So I use the estimation method, method 1, if I'm knitting small accessories. If I'm knitting something much larger, like an adult sweater in the round, casting on at the bottom, I will use this method where I join the yarn tails. If I'm knitting a blanket, I will do the method where I start with the 2 tails where it's not joined, because I'm usually using a washable yarn that won't felt. I had never used that method where you wrap around the needle, but I actually think that's a really good idea for me for smaller width items, because I tend to way overestimate the amount of yarn I need when I just need to cast on a few stitches. So I either way underestimate or way overestimate. So I think I'm going to start using that method where I wrap around the needle, but only for smaller numbers, because I think it gets a little tedious. If you have a different method for establishing the length of the tail for a long tail cast on, I'd love to know what it is, what you like about it, and whether you find it to be reliable. Let me know down in the comments. If you have any other comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.